The parts have arrived. How you doing, guys? Today we're gonna start putting this transmission back together. If you did not see my prior video, this is the original transmission to my 1955 Wheel Horse Senior, which happens to be a mid-30s-ish Ford 3-speed transmission. The exact year I don't know, but I know it's from 32 to 38, somewhere right in there. So, and I got that kind of confirmed because when I bought the parts, which you're about to see, they're the right parts for the transmission. So what did we get? I got what I consider the basics in order to kind of rebuild the transmission itself. For starters, we've got a brand new throwout bearing, this brand new front seal for the transmission. This is a front bearing. This is the main bearing that's right in the front. Mine was all wobbly and blown out, so we got a new one of those. We got the 3 new roller bearings that are required. The cluster gear requires a short and a long, so we got 2 brand new ones. We got those brand new, and then there's another short in the input shaft that's been replaced. This is a slinger or like an oil protector for the back. This kind of keeps the oil from migrating right past the roller bearing. So the one that was in my transmission was all chewed up, so I got a new one of those. That's all set. And then I got 2 new bushings for the clutch fork rod, and as well as I bought like a universal gasket kit for it, so that way I don't have to sit there and make gaskets for it. I also got an NOS first and reverse gear for the tranny also, and I've already, this is the exact 29 tooth 6 spline slide gear that's supposed to be in this transmission. I already fitted it to the shaft, as well as made sure that the teeth and everything are the same. So with that being said, I've got all the parts that I need to rebuild this transmission. First up, I went ahead, let's go back over here real quick. The bushings for the clutch fork. I just took a socket and a hammer and banged them out just like that. They actually go right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make sure those bores are nice and cleaned up. I'm going to put a little bit of oil, and then I'm going to figure out how I'm going to put them in the press. I'm not going to beat them into the transmission with the hammer. I'm going to figure out how I'm going to use my little arbor press, and I'm going to press those bushings in. There is a hole in the bushing, as you can see right there and right there and right there originally. And what that's for is for the grease fitting that goes right there at the bottom. And I got new grease fittings for this transmission also. So pretty much everything gonna get fixed up. So let's get set up and let's put those bushings in the case. Bushings installed. They were kind of a pain in the neck, to be honest with you. They were a little too big, meaning the outer diameter was a little too big. I ended up having to sand the seam where the bearing shell kind of meets together. I sanded that to kind of make it a little smaller, but it was still a heck of a chore to get them in there. But they're in. The clutch fork rod, it slides right in. It's nice and firm. There's no movement, so we're all set there. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and install the lower cluster gear, which is made up of just a few parts here. We have the main pin, which has this little hole at the end. That needs to go to the back side of the transmission because there's a pin that runs through these holes, which holds everything in place. So that has to go that way. The new short roller bearing goes to the front. The new long style roller bearing goes to the back. Obviously, they go inside the cluster gear itself. Also inside the cluster gear is this bearing spacer. This keeps the bearings from floating around too much. We have a front shim, which goes to the front of the case. we have a bearing retainer, which actually goes in like that. And then we have another rear shim, which goes to the back. Now I'm going to go ahead and clean the bearings, and then I'm going to engine assembly lube these bearings. And the reason why I'm going to use engine assembly lube versus like oil is I don't know exactly how long it's going to be before I put this transmission in the tractor itself. And I'm not going to fill it with oil quite yet. I'll fill it with oil when I'm ready to actually use the tractor. So engine assembly lube is going to be used on all the bearings, so none of them dry out or anything to that effect. I'll put a little engine assembly lube on all the shims and everything. So everything will stay nice and lubricated until the time that I put gear oil in this transmission. And in theory, the gear oil that's supposed to be used in this transmission is fairly thick. So I don't think I'll have any issues with that. I mean, if it's good enough for initial startup on an engine, it's going to be more than sufficient to just lubricate the bearings until the oil is actually sloshed around in it. So let me go ahead, get that installed. I'm also going to install it right after that is the reverse gear and pin, which goes in this particular hole, okay? I'm just going to do that all at once and then come back and show you what I've done. I am going to black RTV where the shafts kind of stick out here, and then just once for the cluster gear right there, so that way we can minimize as much of the oil seepage out of the case itself. All right, let me get to it. The shafts are in. I have the pin knocked in so that way the shafts don't fall out. You can't even tell I put any gasket sealer around the shafts themselves, so that way they're semi sealed up, so a huge amount of oil won't migrate out. Everything spins super smooth and nice. I'm really, really happy about how that all kind of worked out. Everything is exactly how I had hoped. Shims are in place. So next up is we're going to go ahead and start putting together this. This is the rear shaft. This is the output shaft, which I need to put the new slide gear on, as well as the second gear, or I shouldn't say the second gear, but the gear actuator between second and third. We'll put that all back together, and then we can start to drop that shaft into the transmission. I'll put the rear bearing on once it's all kind of put together. So in other words, I'll put the assembly together, drop it in, pull it back as far as possible, and then we'll put the input shaft together and send it all home. So let's go ahead. Let me get these parts up on the workbench and we'll start putting it back together. With the output shaft put together, we have the first and reverse slide gear in place. We have, this is second gear with the second gear synchro. It's all in place, clipped in, spins super nice, so we're all good there. I just need to take this little bearing spacer. I need to just slide that back onto the front of this shaft. This is the part that goes into the input shaft with the short bearing. I'll show you how that goes in a few minutes, but I got to put that on. That's not a big deal. The input shaft is pretty simple. Just need to make sure it's good and clean. I'm going to go ahead and take the new front bearing, and with my Dake press here, I'm going to gingerly press it onto the shaft. This is the oil control piece, so that gets sandwiched between the bearing and the gear. Once that's in place, then I have this snap ring that needs to be fitted and snapped into the groove. That keeps the bearing, I guess, from walking off. So we'll put that on. And then once we get these last final pieces, then we can go ahead and drop the shafts back into the case. Everything is in. It actually went in very, very easily. Just as I indicated, just dropped this shaft in, moved it to the rear position, put the input shaft in, just kind of turned it until the teeth meshed, slid this shaft forward until these teeth meshed with the lower cluster gear. The only thing and then I slipped the gear on that goes here that needs to be welded on for the senior. I went ahead and just kind of loosely affixed it. And what I'm noticing is if you see down in here, hopefully, the tooth of the shaft kind of stops, and there's a little bit of space between that and the bearing, and that's allowing this shaft, the slide shaft, here I'll show you, to kind of move back and forth. So when you're going to go ahead and shift into second gear, the shaft would need to slide back a little bit, and then it would engage. And, you know, I just don't like that. So what I want to do is I want to force the shaft as far forward into the bearing as I can, and keeping the distance that this needs to travel into the synchros as close as possible. So I'm going to run to the hardware store, get a couple of these bearings. This one's a little too small. And if I can, meaning diameter-wise, to fit over the shaft, if I can find one that fits better, I don't have to sit there and grind. It looks like maybe one, possibly two of these machine bearings will fit, and it'll take up the slop in the shaft, which means it should shift much, much smoother and nicer. So let me get over to the hardware store. Let's see what we can find. If worst case scenario, I'll just grind out the center of this till it fits real nice onto the shaft, and we'll soak it up with this. Back from the hardware store, I got these two shims. I think they're like 50 thousandths. To be honest with you, I had to file them out a little bit to fit the shaft, but go ahead and we just slide one right in. Then we take the oil control slinger, we put that in. That goes all the way flush mount there, and then nope, that's the thing. I want this one. Yep, this one right here. Here's another one. I put that shim on. We put that right there, and then we take the bearing and we slide the bearing on and slide it right up. Now I'm not going to be able to do this with one hand, but you can see that the snap ring is right up against the block or the case of the transmission. And if I try to wiggle the shaft back and forth, I'm pushing on the bearing with my fingers and trying to move this shaft back and forth. There's nothing. It's perfect. The slide gear slides mint. Obviously, it just pushed it out, but everything is awesome. Oh man, I'm really super happy about all this. So I'm going to go ahead and spin the transmission around. We're going to put the grease seal in. We're going to lube up the bearing, get the gasket, and then we'll bolt the front piece onto the transmission. Installing the front of the transmission is pretty easy. I got to put the new grease seal in, or oil seal. The spring side goes towards the fluid, so it goes in this way. Just going to lube it up, use this washer on it on the press. I'm just going to go ahead and press that in. I'm going to dig up the gasket, put a little bit of oil in the bearing, get the gasket, get the bolts, slide that on, and torque it into place. In order to keep everything together, I just got this flange bolt pinching the bearing hole, the bearing clip, so that stays in place. Man, that's so, oops, you know what it is. Haha. It's the front bearing that's sliding out, but it's shimmed perfectly. So I'm real happy with that. I'll pull this bolt out when I get ready to put the back of the transmission back on. So let me go ahead. Let's get that whole front section on. Looking to the rear of the transmission before I officially button it all up, I wanted to make sure that everything lined up. I had these grade 8 cap bolts in stock. They're brand new, but they were too long. So I went ahead and cut them down so they fit flush with the case. The shim, you can see one of my, that right there, you can see one of my shims. This is a oil control baffle, and then there's another shim right behind it. Then the bearing slides in, and then the gear case goes on top of that. And then there's a wire snap ring on the bearing, which holds everything together. And if you go like this on the shaft, there's probably a half a thousandths worth of play. So there's literally nothing. And the thing turns so smooth and nice. I bet you this thing would shift on the fly. Because when I took mine apart, this was all loose, and I've heard in the past that these shafts are loose in these transmissions. They slide back and forth as you're trying to shift the gears. Mine is going to be 100% in line with, like where it's supposed to be. And mine, on the cover that goes here, there's actual witness marks where this shaft must have slid back and rubbed the plate that goes here, and I'll show you that probably in another video, but that's no longer going to be the case. Here's the gear that I machined a while ago for this. It slides on, it fits absolutely perfect. I'm not going to weld it because it's supposed to be welded to the shaft. I'm not going to weld it to the shaft until I'm ready to actually physically put this all together. We got plenty of clearance between that and what will become the plate for the torque tube. And when we grab the actual drive shaft, and I'm going to try to do this with one hand. Just bear with me for a second here, guys. Nope, there we go. And we seat it. Yeah, we're right there. We're perfect. So that's going to be just the way I like it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and unbolt all of this and then put it all back together. Torque all the bolts down. I'll probably put them like about 20 foot-pounds, 25 foot-pounds, somewhere right around there. And the back of the transmission will be complete. Let's get it done. Next up is putting the clutch fork arm and clutch fork back into the case. Pretty simple. Oh, and I got to press the new throwout bearing on the cage. Pretty simple process. Just take that, stick it through. There's a 5/16 roll pin that holds it all into place, and then press the throwout bearing on. And I'm just going to put a little bit of grease right here so it slides nice and neat. Put the new return spring on, and then that's it. And I think for this video we'll be right at the tail end. And there she is, pretty much all back together. The only thing I need to do is the shift tower. We'll do that in the next video. We'll clean that all up, tear it all apart, clean it all up, and then we'll reinstall it and make sure all the gears shift like they should. But overall, I don't foresee any problems. I threw together this quick little wood box just to keep it up off the ground, because one of the things, the reason why the original spring here got hyperextended is because this arm kept banging around and I catch it on something because it's right up against the floor. So just threw this box together so that way when I have it stored away until I'm ready to install it, it'll sit fairly level, number one, and we'll keep this up off the ground. But this thing actuates nice and smooth. You can see I'm not even really pushing on it. So that looks really, really good. The input shaft, I'm spinning it. I got to do it counterclockwise. There it is. That is smooth as butter. Everything seems to be working real good. There's just a couple thousandths end play in the shaft, which is exactly what I want to see, right? You don't want it to be bound up. bearing torqued. Everything is sealed up. It shouldn't leak oil. All right, guys. Oh, and then if you want to just take a little gander inside, everything looks A-okay. All right, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you're interested, I did put together a couple playlists. I'm starting to go through my videos and set up playlists, but the 1955 Wheel Horse Senior playlist is put together and growing. So with that, I really appreciate all your viewership. You guys have a great day.